Welcome to the Sitecore sessions, where our Sitecore experts discuss Sitecore. This is episode 5, where our panel will discuss DevOps.
Hi, everyone. David Filippo. I'm the principal of our Sitecore practice at Proficient. I'm a 5-time Sitecore MVP, and I've been all around the new functionality and the move to the new with XM Cloud and what it means for things like DevOps.
I'm Luke Pace, lead technical consultant here at Proficient. Been working with Sitecore now for about 6 years, primarily doing all things DevOps.
My name is Nick Sturdivant. I'm a senior solution architect here at Proficient. I've been working with Sitecore for about 6 or 7 years, I think, and have worked with Luke on a few XM Cloud / headless projects. So yeah, it's been fun.
Would be not a big surprise to say that I'm also involved in solution architecture. My name is Martin Miles. I am 8-time Sitecore technology MVP. And similarly to David San Filippo, I know the product from all the sides around. So all the new and shiny edges of XM Cloud, as well as lots of legacy stuff. I remember Sitecore when it was in the earlier stage, like version 5 or early 6, more than a decade ago.
I wanted to thank you all for joining. Today's topic, as you guys know, is DevOps. And as Martin was saying, I mean, we've been around the block with Sitecore for a number of years and kind of seen this evolution from where we were. I actually remember the first time I got involved in the Sitecore project and no one knew how to install it. And I ended up terminal servicing to various servers to run the installer. And it's just come so far since those days, and especially today with XM Cloud, with headless, with Next.js. I mean, it's a completely different ecosystem, it's a completely different approach. And I really want to hear from you guys, kind of what your experience has been and what you're seeing right now, and is it getting better?
For me, I'd say it's so much better, because when I first started with Sitecore about 6 years ago, I think it was maybe on the fringe of Sitecore 8, maybe early Sitecore 9. Coming in, it was painful to go through and build out environments, set up all these virtual machines, go through and do, especially if you're doing XP, which everybody was, and then go to all the machines and manage all the configuration. And there wasn't a lot of standardization around trying to automate things. We didn't have like the Sitecore install framework now, like you can run distributed installs and stuff. So it was so labor intensive and just riddled with errors. And it would, when we were going through and estimating, we'd have to, have these huge footprints and spend hours and hours, days and weeks to go through and just get something set up out of the box. And now, on these XM Cloud projects that Nick and I have worked on, I mean, it takes a few minutes and I can get something up and running. It just makes it a lot easier to get up and running. I can now look at the developers and say, hey, hurry up, where's your application to get running? They're not waiting on me now. It's a little bit more the other way around.
Yeah, no, and I think as a developer, we shared a lot of the same heartburn, right? Gone are the days, thankfully, of the monolithic README files that is like thousands of lines of markdown. Run your MSI, install SQL Server, install this security patch, go change these configurations. Like having that local containerized environment has been huge. The amount of time that we save, and while it's not entirely true that gone completely are the days of, well, it works on my machine, there is still some of that, as we saw on a recent project, but that had more to do with the client's security policies behind their firewall. But generally speaking, yeah, I would agree, Luke. I would say it's vastly better. And I would add too that if you're developing locally, at least for me, one of the biggest things that I think folks take for granted these days is if you're developing locally and you're changing a bunch of content. In the past, you had to publish to your locally like running WebDB, and with the containerized environment that Sitecore now publishes, you click save, you control tab back to your next application or view application or React application or Angular or whatever, and the changes are there. You're not waiting on those to hit web and be cached and all that. So that's also huge.
I remember myself being so sick and tired from doing this type of manual installation, as you guys fairly described, that I had to invent this tool. You may have heard of it. It's called Siphon. I call it a Swiss Army knife for Sitecore local development, where you can do one-click download installation and all the bits of Sitecore just for your virtual machine or local instance. But you can have as many of them as you want. You can even control them over network, and like all the bells and whistles. So that alone saved me plenty of time. But I remember the pain. I share the pain with you. And in my opinion, the biggest improvement or the biggest change I would name was virtualization. So thankfully to virtualization, we now have this variety of cloud services, because all these cloud services and things behind SaaS products, it's basically run on the virtualization. If you take a look how XM Cloud works, it's still effectively Kubernetes. And even the containers we have, they get shipped deployed there.
One thing I've noticed, I mean, it feels a lot like, at least for me, like I'm using a lot of tools that only understand maybe to the 70th percentile of how they actually work, which is usually enough to troubleshoot when things go wrong, but it's also very easy to get completely out of my depth. Like I've gotten somewhat familiar with like the Docker files and Docker Compose, but you get to a certain point, especially with some of the underlying services, that it becomes really hard to troubleshoot anything or fix anything without reaching out to someone who knows a little better. I'm wondering if you guys feel similarly, or have you kind of mastered the stack from soup to nuts?
Can you believe, guys, Docker is more than a decade on the market already? As I remember, it was released first in 2013, or anyway, kind of decade or so. I know it's been delayed into the world of Windows development, where most of us sit, but it made a big change. And I very love this joke. Basically, what Docker is, it solves the problem which is called "it works on my machine." So previously, we had all these cumbersome setups. So if it works on your machine, then you can ship on your machine, right? That's what we try to avoid. So coming back to Windows, the world of Windows machine, I would probably name several changes that are revolutionary. So the first was obviously virtualization, which come from the CPUs being supportive to that technology. And with Windows, we got Hyper-V, and Hyper-V alone was a big, not big, huge time saver for me in the world of Windows development, because I could have fixed state of my virtual machine, I could revert it back, I could create endless checkpoints. So the only disk storage volume was kind of a limiter for me, but I never worked less on 2 terabytes of storage. So, okay, thanks to the virtualization, we got Windows subsystem for Linux, which alone is kind of virtualization, but it allows us naturally have a Windows kernel, a Linux kernel right in the Windows in parallel. And basically, this is how I work for many. Like when I do Kubernetes, I use WSL because it's simply more natural and comfortable to me.
So moving this conversation back to DevOps, let's take a step back from containers and talk a little bit about Azure. And I know over the years, Luke, you and I have collaborated a lot on kind of the move from IaaS to PaaS to Kubernetes, before getting into kind of the front end cloud stuff we'll talk about a little bit later. But kind of what's your thought on that whole growth curve that we kind of seen as Azure matured and as Sitecore matured and how it adopted it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a natural progression. There's other applications and platforms that have made that shift sooner. And I always personally thought, even when I first started and we were doing IaaS and people were primarily doing XP, and it was this monolith and very powerful, but in a lot of cases underutilized, of thinking to myself of, why is this so complicated when it's only getting used for a fraction of its capabilities? So
Yeah.
I've enjoyed seeing that kind of natural progression into a composable stack of microservices. And actually, I was just talking with somebody else we work with today of having a conversation with the client, and it was almost humorous of a comment. There's this a mindset shift of being comfortable of finding the tools that work best for the different scenarios. That's the whole idea of being composable, is you kind of break it down into these small logical pieces, and then it's your footprint. It might look larger on paper because maybe you have different services that are running different pieces, but in reality, that's the beauty of it. You're not having this, huge monolith that is tedious to uh, work with on a day-to-day basis, and maybe you're not even getting the most value out of it. So I enjoy it. Makes my job a lot easier, and it makes it to where you're not having to manage and maintain things that you're not using. You start with a nice simple base, and then build up on top of that. If you want to, add Content Hub, or you can go and add that. If you want to add some kind of something for managing analytics, there's different services for that. You go and find what you need, and then you add it, and it just makes it much more manageable on a day-to-day basis.
Just going back to your comment on deploying XP, I remember how painful it was if you ever wanted to customize XDB or XConnect.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of config changes you needed to make in all the different services.
Yeah.
I mean, usually we never even got to thinking about DevOps for that, because it
Mm-hmm.
changed so infrequently, and it was such a pain in the butt to
Yeah.
deal with.
And even just simple things as like having to manage the certificates for all of those different services so that they could all communicate securely. Like that was a whole mess on its own. And again, going back of like people are like, well, we'll leave it there in case we use it, but by the time we got around to thinking about it, we're usually still developing on the core application, and then we're like, we'll get to that eventually, and it just kind of sat in the background, and the DevOps team and infrastructure team are there keeping the lights on, and like it wasn't getting used as much. So this makes more sense of like, let's start with the core base, and if you want it, then there's other services out there that we can use that we can really just focus on how we implement those and not how do we keep them running.
Yeah, or like even worse, right? When the client pays for that, or they are paying for that in with their Sitecore licensing fees, and they don't end up using it, despite what we may say or not say to them about it. Yeah, it was always a shame to see that.
Yeah, thinking about it, like I know, like especially in the last couple of years, we did a lot with like infrastructure as code, like Terraform, and automating some of the pain points that you mentioned. At the same time, it feels like it was still a lift. Like instead of doing the lift, configure everything on the servers, you're doing the lift and kind of configuring your Terraform scripts and get everything running. I mean, what are your thoughts with infrastructure as code, and kind of do we see that continuing on as we move into XM Cloud, into Node and Next.js and stuff like that?
Yeah, infrastructure as code, yes, is still really valuable. And we've talked about this, I think, DSF of XM Cloud is great, but it's not the fit for everyone right now. And some organizations maybe can't go there yet. There's a lot of big enterprises that want to keep things in-house and want to have that finer control over all the details. And so we have a lot of work with a lot of past projects still, and having it infrastructure built out as code makes it much easier to customize it and maintain it for reusability in case you ever have any disasters, you want to expand. I mean, you can go through and do some stuff by hand, or you might, there's like the Sitecore Azure Toolkit is really helpful to get you started, but having something customized is really valuable because we do see a lot of past projects still, and it can be kind of tedious to go through and do it by hand every single time.
Yeah, I'm interested in your experiences collectively with it. So I know we've all been part of conversations with the client about especially this tends to come up when you're talking to the client's IT team or their like infrastructure team. You're talking about IAC, and someone inevitably says, "What about multi-cloud?" Right? Like, how many times in the history of every Sitecore project that you've worked on have you had a customer say, "We're on Azure today, but we may be on something else later"? I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but it hasn't yet happened for me. And the amount of engineering that goes into making a multi-cloud IAC deployment work, and that could happen for multiple reasons, right? Maybe they're transitioning, they have some corporate level agreement with, whoever, Azure, Amazon, or it's for disaster recovery, right? Like they just want to have another cloud provider host their, hot site or whatever they want to call it. But I'm interested in your experiences about like when that's actually come up and mattered, like at all.
That is really good call. That is a really good call, because hybrid cloud and multi-cloud, they are even more commonly met these days. So what we get now, we get diversity of technologies, or even diversity of tech stacks sometimes. And it's not just what you mentioned. Sometimes it's done to avoid a vendor lock. With XM Cloud, we're already avoiding vendor lock in some capacity, but clients want more freedom. The clients want
as long as
more
the vendor is
technologies.
Sitecore, right, Martin?
Say again?
As long as the vendor is Sitecore, right, Martin?
No. Okay, let's pick it up. Easiness of configuration. You can have today Sitecore Connect, which connects a Sitecore product, any of them, to a non-Sitecore product, and you can plug pretty everything. Yes, it charges you for connections, right? But it saves you some time for writing your own custom connectors. If you have a high-load website, you probably would do everything yourself, and not because just you want to save, but because you want to optimize every byte going through your connection, right? Maybe you want to add extra level of cache, and maybe you want to add extra level of security, because we have dev, not just DevOps, but DevSecOps today, and security is the king. But if you are doing a quick POC, you definitely would want to benefit from Sitecore Connect. You will pay almost nothing, but you can quickly plug all the variety of systems we have now in the composable world from variety of platforms together with Sitecore. And that, again, gives you option to avoid vendor lock. Vendor lock sucks these days. No one wants it in 2024.
So going back to your question, it's come up a number of times in conversations with prospects and clients. I don't think we've actually ever done it because it's been cost prohibitive, right? It's a lot, not only from just paying the hosting fees and the infrastructure fees, the additional duplicative setup, right, as well as the operational costs of managing environments. Unless you're operating at that level on that scale, it's probably not going to be worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've never seen. I've had it come up in conversations, like you said, but never actually had to switch or gone through. And I mean, these platforms now, they're so large and so mature. I mean, these providers, like even in Azure, you go and build something out pretty simplistic. The SLAs on everything is so high, and they offer so many built-in options for making things even more highly available than they are. So it's like, whichever one your organization is going with, unless they're making some a top level shift, the likelihood that you would need to change is super low.
Yeah, I think for a lot of them, just knowing that they could is enough, right?
Yeah.
Well, I remember, I mean, it was years ago. It was back in the perpetual license days, and just the idea of going back to Sitecore to get the additional licenses for the other data center was a concern, was an issue, right?
What I want to say, when I was asked this question about a multi-cloud by a client, I replied, okay, it's all possible these days, but do you as organization have enough skills in-house to support that multi-cloud? Because now you basically have to multiply the metrics of tech stack from one technology to another technology. Do you have the specialists? Would you want to outsource that? Maybe you want to apply some other hybrid models similar to what we have as MSO at Proficient. And the client just came back in a couple of days and said, okay, we are basically okay to get the most advised path.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between Sitecore and Microsoft has been so strong. I would say 85-90% of our clients have deployed to Azure, whether their own Azure subscription or managed cloud, which is also run on Azure, right? We've seen a handful of AWS over the years where that's kind of a preferred platform. And even more recently, we saw a GCP request that you guys were helping me out estimating. But like, I don't see that changing anytime soon, at least in the Sitecore world.
Yeah, it's just there's such a tight coupling there with their partnership. I mean, I was talking to that of I've done projects on AWS and on GCP as well, and it's always more difficult than doing it with Azure.
Yeah.
You know, like there's a reason that they have specifically packages for Azure App Services. Like if you want it, you can't take that and go and deploy it on in
As a
some
good
kind of
example,
PaaS application in
look,
AWS. Like the databases alone, like it's Azure SQL and Amazon's was it RDS? They're not the same. So we always have to take a little bit of extra steps to put it in, something that's not Azure. So it can be done, but it's you just start to have to ask that question of is it worth it?
Right.
I mean, is our organization that closely tied to one of these other providers that it's worth the extra effort to kind of take the round peg and put it into the square hole a little bit
by force? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The ROI has to be there, right? I mean, otherwise, why bother?
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking about Azure DevOps and Microsoft technologies in general, not sometimes, often for the clients, it's even difficult to substitute Azure DevOps in favor of GitHub. So what to say about multi-cloud? That's how they are tied to Microsoft technologies. And I often see this request saying that we need this specific DevOps platform and no deviations could be done.
I've been seeing that lately, a lot more clients moving away from Azure DevOps to like GitHub Enterprise. Like Microsoft owns them both right now. I'm not even really sure. Do anyone have an idea? Like, are they eventually going to merge into one? Be kept
It's a
separate?
great question.
Like, I have no idea.
I don't think so.
I'm not sure. It doesn't necessarily concern me as much. I mean, because that's the really flexible part of it. I mean, a lot of the deployments nowadays. I know maybe we're going to talk about the old ways of deploying, like the new ways now with especially in XM Cloud. It's really simple using these APIs and CLIs. You can really just kind of pick that up and take it anywhere you want anyway. So there's some nice features of all the different platforms, but that doesn't concern me as much. It's a pretty easy transition.
Well, GitHub is where all the cool GitHub Copilot stuff is happening, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I know that they've talked about in Azure DevOps. It seems like they've been talking about it for a while for deprecating like the visual pipeline editing experience and making it all YAML based. Anyway, I don't know if they'll do that. I mean, it's all YAML behind the scenes anyway, and that's the way to go to really have control over it. But I mean,
the hint there is that they call it the classic editor, right?
Yeah.
That's your subtle hint to switch to multi-stage YAML.
Getting back to DevOps itself, right? So I'm not at the point in my career where I'm that close to the metal when it comes to deployments and things like that, right? But I get the sense, like with these cloud platforms, these front-end cloud platforms like Vercel and Netlify, that there's a lot less effort around setting that stuff up. Like you see some of the demos with XM Cloud Deploy and its tight integration with some of these tools. It looks like it's so easy to set up and manage. But I know the reality is there's probably some things that still need to be done to get it to work to meet a client's needs. I'm just curious, kind of what's your perspective on this move to these front-end cloud services and how much more they do and how much easier is it actually getting versus where are the pitfalls of the things people may not be thinking about when they adopt these things and they still have to think about in order to be successful?
That actually times easier now to do the deployment, especially if you are using XM Cloud build and deploy app. So you just click a button and that everything happens magically in the background. But again, the principles behind this deployment are still the same as we had before. And when it comes to Vercel, it is effectively a rendering host somewhere running there on a Linux machine. So it still spins up thanks to virtualization. Nothing is hidden from us. But again, with Vercel specifically, we have not vendor log, but kind of that approach, because Vercel is the company that creates Next.js. If you do deploy with Next.js, all these latest and greatest will be supported on Vercel, and other platforms like Latify, they pick it up later with some latency. And if you do self-hosted approach, then good luck implementing all the recent versions of all the dependencies. But again, coming to the deployment, I think the progress has been significant, dramatically simplifying things. I would not count it in the technologies, I would count it in millions of human hours of developers who now don't bother doing this repetitive, unwanted manual work again. And really good analog is that we spoke about infrastructure as a code, right? So if you take a look at your Docker file, Docker Compose, isn't that infrastructure as a code? Yes, it runs into your own local Docker container, but you still dictate with the code how you want to set it up. You still set up networking between these containers. That's it. If you open up xmcloud.build.json file, you will see rendering host configuration. So I now currently have 3 rendering hosts right now here at my code. And that's also kind of deployment instruction, how I'd like to get this rendering host built. For example, I'm throwing different source code folders to different rendering hosts because I'm running different websites, one on a Tailwind, another on a Bootstrap. So you see, the technologies are emerging, and for me personally, they are making my life so much easier.
Now, I was going to say, you're not wrong, DSF, in thinking that it's significantly easier. I think it is significantly easier and simplified. Martin kind of mentioned, that it's really the same processes behind the scenes. It's just a bit abstracted from you. I'd say that maybe is the one piece that can be difficult sometimes, is if you do run into an issue, there's only so much you can necessarily do to fix it. And most of the time, there's nothing you could do if it's related to, for example, we had an issue on a project where we were having some deployments to XM Cloud fail, and it was an issue behind the scenes with, I think, some storage in a container that Sitecore was running, or I forget all the specific details of it. But going back to like when I first started, it was Sitecore ship and TDS, and you couldn't even deploy if the application was broken. So if your package was wrong and you broke the application, and you had to go back and roll everything back, and then going into PaaS and web deploy packages, that was easy enough to manage, and you could deploy anytime you wanted and do zero downtime much easier. And if you had an issue, okay, just build a new package, fix it, push it out, you'll be good to go. So we're still building off of those, I think, same technologies like Martin said, but yeah, I mean, they're handling all of the logic for you. It's pretty much about as point and click as you can get, I would say. And outside of doing some kind of shifting left to make sure all your stuff's going to compile correctly, maybe do some linting, some unit testing and things like that in-house, you can pretty confidently push them right out to these platforms and let them handle it all for you.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I think specifically the CLIs offer a lot of flexibility in how you want to build your pipelines, right? Like, yes, both XM Cloud Deploy and Vercel have tight integrations with source control. I think GitHub and ASDO, if I'm not mistaken. But I know on our projects, I've personally enjoyed the flexibility that we enjoy using the CLI and being able to kind of say, hey, I want this to go here at this time. But to your point, Dave, like when things do go wrong, I think there's been a shift in skill set in a way, because it's not, oh, I'm going to go, like pour over the ASO logs for hours. It's, I need to know which of these SaaS platforms I need to go to, and I need to know how to get to those log files within those. And I don't know if anyone has pulled or if anyone has had to pull a lot of logs from like the Sitecore XMCloud CM. The UI, somewhat interestingly, is actually not the best way, at least I found. Like you can only look at certain individual files. You can't like download all of them at once. Maybe they're working on that feature, I don't know. But this CLI though is absolutely clutch. Like you can get certain ranges of log files and like pre-filter them, and it's great. So
Nick, you naturally led me to the question I would like to ask the audience. So all these deployment tools we have today as 2024, they are amazing. And as I said, we can do deployment with XMCloud build deploy app in a click. We can do lots of things, simple and easy, even with CLI, right? So we still are far away from ideal world. What is one biggest change you would like to improve with all these products, with all these approaches we were talking about? Maybe if you have more than one, tell me. And I would start first. Why I say you naturally led this conversation is that what I wanted to say as an example, navigating through log files is difficult. Log files are text files, which again are subject to language models. So I would like to introduce a language model into DevOps, or at least this Azure DevOps application, so that I can send it natural comments saying like, there was an error in my build. First of all, tell me where this error occurred. Okay, in this model, what exactly this error mean? Because in most cases, I simply don't understand the error, especially if it's not verbose. Sometimes they say one thing, especially we saw that with .NET, in the .NET world when it complains. Remember when you install C, something with C errors you get, and it actually means totally different thing, right? So that I would like this natural language models to come and search for me, find all the possible situations where this potential error may occur, and provide potential solutions or things to check. Or maybe do some work on my behalf, checking the config files, because underneath a build and deploy app, it has access to all the source code, because we are basically sending it. If you look at the CLI, we provide a work directory to the CLI that it takes and deploys and builds. So obviously it has access to all the context, to all the source code. So it is able to even spot the location in the source code and tell me what exactly I'm doing wrong. So these kind of tools I would like to get built in, and maybe some sort of helpful documentation or examples how people suggest me to troubleshoot. But maybe there are other things you can advise me. What would you like to improve?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got it are spot on, Martin. I mean, that was my experience, and I know, like how I was saying, shifting left on our projects. That's kind of what Nick and I would do. Is we didn't want to just send code off to XMCloud or Vercel and wait for it to compile there and fail, and then us have to go hunt down what happened because it didn't send it back to us, or we would have to go and customize to make sure that we were getting that info back with our CLI commands. So we would just build out and kind of do all that beforehand, those internal checks. And if something failed on a PR, then I'd be like, hey, Nick, this PR failed. We'll go dig through the logs and be like, okay, well, it could be this. Let me go and check, wherever and make this update and push it back up. So we were having to, still do a lot of that on our own. So I feel that's like a pretty natural next step, is to integrate more of that feedback into the tools themselves to make the velocity much easier.
I think we've all experienced this, but that whole issue that we had with the Sitecore CLI deploying to XMCloud, where we had to kind of change up how we were handling the command. Whereas before, I think it was Sitecore Cloud deploy, and then you would be in your working path and it would just work. That specific issue that we had, where because of, I think it it ended up where the feedback that we were getting from that CLI command, you would get this nice like progress, right? Like you get like 1%, 5%, and like that would be great. But then we found that after a certain amount of time, it would just time out. The deployment in XM Cloud Deploy would actually report a failure, but then the task in the ASDO pipeline would actually report a false positive, because it wasn't capturing the actual result of the deployment. So I mean, shifting left on things like that makes a lot of sense, and ideally it would do both, right? The CLI Cloud Deploy command would give you the nice visual of, this is what I'm working on now. I'm compiling the editing host, I'm running it, I'm compiling the VS solution, and then return that actual return code of 1 or a 0 if it failed or not, and ideally that would match what XM Cloud Deploy is saying as well. I think they're going to get there. It's just going to take some time.
I
I did see
experienced
that.
that, Nick, at also with GitHub Actions. I know what you mean. Basically, you get the result code of execution of the command, like of how command executed and returned, rather than result behind what it executed. And one of the things I would expect is those of you who have taken XM Cloud certification exam know that what we have in CLI is a set of plugins, which are defined in Sitecore.json files. And basically, I would expect Sitecore to open up the specification how I can make my own extension and plugins to CLI. That would be so awesome, and it would address your issue. For example, if I get the source code of the CLI, I would probably want to extend it, or maybe developers would change it. But of course, I understand it's a break and change because it's already widespread across. But at least give us an option to do that.
So, Nick, you said a couple times, and just for everyone who may not have heard the term, shift left. Why didn't you explain that?
Shift left. Shift left, of course, in IT in general, is this concept of making mistakes and fixing things as early as possible, right? So you don't want your production deployment to be the first time that you see an error. Ideally, that happens on the developer's machine, and they fix it long before any end users can see it. So when we say shift left, we mean fail fast and fail early, which I think is not a new concept, but maybe that phrase might be newer. I don't know.
Yeah, great explanation. So going back to your question about the future, Martin, I mean, the way I see it, and like, I'm not sure how much longer we're even going to have a CM container, right? Like, I think eventually it becomes a SaaS offering. I mean, there's already lots of guidance not to customize the CM, right? And I think that's in advance of it eventually being not a container, not something you have to deal with. I mean, we've seen some of the GitHub spaces, right? So that you could set up a dev environment without using a container, without using Docker. I don't know if that eventually leads to it or something else, but if you want my prediction for the future, I'm not sure it's going to be in the next year, but I would be surprised if in 5 years we're still using containers.
I think you're right, and there I think there are also other signs of that, right? Like we found this on a recent project, where we kind of made several customizations, meaning like C# code that we deployed to the CM, and those just straight up will not work in some of the newer constructs, right? Like XM Cloud Pages. If you're building, say, a custom piece of code to like change how the content tree renders, XM Cloud Pages is a completely separate application. It's not even calling into any C# assemblies, right? Like that's just not going to work. So I would agree that does seem to be the trend, and I could see some point in the future where it's like, okay, if you want to do anything custom on the CM, there's this kind of like walled off, siloed place where you do that. You don't deploy compiled assemblies.
You just led me naturally to something we all been asking from 2022. Get us to customize Pages application.
Well, yeah. Not to show my age, but it reminds me a lot about how we used to build custom SharePoint solutions. I know that's the S word that we're not supposed to say, but Microsoft then had the same kind of shift, right? Where it's like, get your custom code off of the SharePoint server, and they introduced the whole app model where SharePoint devs could build their applications sort of completely off the server, so they're not, hosing it every other day.
Great conversation, guys. We got 10 minutes left. Why don't we go final thoughts on the topic from everybody?
Well, I saw Experience Edge here, and it occurred to me that, like, I ideally, strictly in terms of DevOps, right? Experience Edge is really just like an appliance, right? Like, I feel like we shouldn't see pipelines that are like purging cache, purging content, like, unless you're doing something very, very niche and specific. That should kind of just be a SaaS thing that it's an appliance, right? Like, it just works. Occasionally you do have to interact with it. If you do things like provision like webhooks, if you're doing on-demand read validation or like something fancy like that. But going back to your earlier point, Dave, about like composable architecture, it does seem like there's a trade-off, right? Like, yes, it's nice that we can snap everything in, but at the same time, at least for me as a developer and an architect, I do feel like there's a black box trade-off there happening as well, right? It's like, I know things are happening here and I know it's affecting my application. I have to know where to go, how to interact with that system, how to see what's happening there. Experience Edge is of course just one example of that. But yeah.
And that raises actually some concern in my head, because yes, I would agree with you. We know what most of our black boxes are and how they work internally. Eventually, CM will become another black box. We don't even know what it will be, but it will be black box. At this stage, we know exactly how it works. We know the pipelines. We know all the bells and whistles underneath. We can even customize this at this stage at least. And if we want to do custom resolvers, we have to do that. We have to write custom C# code, all the bits. But again, we are not to disclose our age. At this peak of our career, now we get millions of junior people who are starting their careers and who obviously don't know how things are done under the hood. So for them, many of these technologies become kind of religious boxes. They just need to believe in how they work and pray that they will work. They cannot poke into that. They cannot get their historical knowledge of these technologies. So that is my concern, how things would work in the future. If we roll back, let's say to the 1970s, where it all started, at least the universal time starts from 1970, where all the computers started. I remember myself starting my career being assembler developer. So I was actually writing these, not bytecode, but actually this binary code. Then I switched to C, then I switched to C++. In the beginning of millennium, there was .NET framework released, and that was a big revolution for me, jumping from managed from the manual memory allocation to managed memory control with this garbage collector. I remember that like a big jump ahead. And I know all the things happening under the hood, but like I say, there's lots of developers who don't even get a clue how it all works. And when it comes to maintenance and support, what will happen?
That's a huge point, and we've actually seen that happen with, I should say, a couple of our clients, specifically their dev teams. So you have this situation where you've got these Sitecore devs and architects that have been constructing and maintaining these web forms, MVC applications, and then they hear these words like Vercel and Next.js, and they're writing Next.js/React components rather than writing MVC views or controller views, and it's a big sea change. And so far, I don't know if this is true for, of course, all of our clients, but it's been a hill to climb, I think, for most of our clients' dev teams that kind of own the solution once it does ship. And in a way, that's good. maybe, but it's a very large learning curve. Oh, sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of this just turns into magic, right? Like it reminds me of that quote, which I'm sure someone else said, but I only remember from Star Trek: "Sufficiently advanced technology seems like magic." Because a lot you're in the weeds, you're developing a component, but you're not seeing the forest from the trees, so you don't really understand where everything fits and how it works. So the only advice I'd give is take a step out and try to really understand it from the broader spectrum before, and then go back in and it'll take that to get your mind around it.
Yeah, even not to go far away from that, not to go to assembler and bytecode. If we take Next.js, for example, I really love coding with Next.js and all the things it brings to us, especially with new approach. But it's still JavaScript. And going there, you compare how vanilla JavaScript differs from what we do with Next.js. It's such a big jump ahead, and that is the matter of just a decade in time.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all love to believe the concept electricity is just we get it from a socket without thinking where it is actually coming from. Same here, but at some stage we need to know the technology behind.
And from a DevOps specific point of view, I would say when I gave a user group presentation towards the end of last year, we were talking about how easy it was to set everything up and to manage these releases and deployments. And so someone asked the question of, well, why do we need DevOps anymore if it's so easy? And I would argue the point that it doesn't, just because it's easy is not going to do away with the DevOps role and DevOps idea. In some cases, it might be more important. If you're talking about managing all these microservices and you have multiple applications and the different services and different platforms, if you just go off and start, picking things, at random and kind of cobbling them together and not understanding how are we going to manage these, what's our workflow going to be, you'll quickly wind up in quite a mess.
Absolutely.
So, just because it's easy to utilize them, I still think the concepts of DevOps are still around and important. You need to. They're not the most flashiest things to talk about. Marketers don't get excited about them. Business doesn't look at them and be like, why do we need to invest money into defining these processes and analyzing the tools that we're going to use, but because you don't see that
log grains.
Yeah, you don't see that on the end. Your clients don't see that, but they'll definitely feel it if it's set up poorly, because that's going to impact your tech team that's going to be implementing these tools that are trying to implement all the requirements that the business is laying out. So you see it down the road. You don't see it at face value, but I think it's still. Exactly.
That's the paradox. The better it runs, the more it just goes smoothly. Nobody thinks it's like nobody knows you're doing anything at all.
Right.
There's another quote there. I can't remember.
Generally speaking, it's not just technology. There is a huge cultural shift that happens with the world of DevOps over the last decade, at least over the last decade. And like companies, people, industry, they all adopt this cultural shift of DevOps. That became a thing. And look, answering your question, probably the final thing of this conversation is you asked, why do we need DevOps at all? I will tell you one example. Here internally in our organization, every time we're talking of DevOps, or generally, if we do estimation, if we talk about the project, DevOps topic immediately pops up with your name. Like there was almost none of the such conversations without naming you by name. That's how DevOps is important.
Yeah, and I'm appreciative that we plan like that internally. It's been definitely a shift over the years, and I'm still surprised when we come across somewhat large organizations that maybe don't have established those processes. They've gone off, and maybe they've just gone so far and they're kind of too far in to realize that we need to make that investment and go back and establish these processes. So it kind of reinforces the point of, if you don't lay that foundation out from the get-go, then it's just going to be harder to go back and re-implement it later.
Yep. I think the tagline is shift left on your DevOps.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, guys, we're just about out of time. I want to thank you all. This has been a great conversation. Hope to have you again sometime.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks
Thanks
everyone.
all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.